that's the point I wanted to sort of come to is as we were talking about the Overton window, we spoke about Beanstalk, but then one of the things I've kind of figured out in my dotage in this format is that I like a deck that has two legacy power level things to do.
EternalDurdles.com is the home for Magic the Gathering written content. If you want to write an article for EternalDurdles.com, reach out to @ForceOfPhil on all social media or Discord. You can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/EternalDurdles. As part of your membership, you'll get access to an additional 15-minute audio episode every week and ad-free listening on all episodes. That's patreon.com/EternalDurdles. What it do?
So, Phil, this episode of the podcast has nefarious ends. Because I was looking at your miracles list, your recent miracles list, and I saw one Terminus in your miracles list, and I thought to myself, what is this deck doing? It's not doing the legacy power level thing that I could see, which is cast miracle cards, cast cards that would cost way more if they weren't miracled. And that got me thinking, one, what the hell are you doing with this blue-white deck that is now not a miracles deck? And two, I wanted to have a broader topic discussion about changing the Overton window for the legacy power level thing to do, because apparently that has changed with your deck. Sometimes it's useful, especially after a ban, to look around and say, hey, am I playing a deck that is of the power level of the things that are happening around me?
Yeah, I think that the way that the Overton window shifts pretty heavily, given, obviously power creep will come in and change things on that front for what cards make sense actually at the competitive tables and which cards are no longer viable. But it's also interesting, like if we were to talk about the shift in perception as well when it comes around. So like before the ban, when sowing Mycospawn was legal, there was this perception that control was just flat unplayable because of its existence, and that you could just never beat the decks that were playing that card. Now, while that I agree is true, like the control decks were never beating sowing Mycospawn, that was just never going to happen. The percentage of what sowing Mycospawn was of the format was enough that if you ran into that percentage over the course of a long event, you were not going to win that event. However, if you dodged that percentage, which is totally reasonable to do, maybe you face it once, and if you're otherwise strong against everything else or favorable against everything else or well practiced enough against everything else, that you may be able to overcome the percentage of that deficit, that maybe your deck isn't unplayable in the aggregate. Right? Like, yes, your control deck is unplayable against specifically sowing Mycospawn, but if you dodge that percentage of the field, which was not overwhelming, then you actually would be well set up to play against like Blue Black Reanimator and all of the decks that, your deck would otherwise be well situated against. That's where, like, when I had my good run before the bans, it's because I wasn't running into all those Ancient Tomb decks in a high clip. And so I was like, I was favorable in a lot of the matchups that I was presented against, because I was just like, I'm just going to dodge. And like, it was like when we had Fenris Cloud on, where he was like, yep, given the online versus paper meta, I'm just going to not play consigns or play consigns, so I'm just going to hope to dodge, right? Like I'm planning to dodge those matchups, and if I catch the odd end of variance on that, that's a meta call that I'm willing to make. Now, that's different from, like, your control deck is good in that position if you're looking to dodge that particular percentage of the meta. But if your control deck now, as an example, is playing in a field where everybody is testing new Beanstalk variations with Rakshasa
It's the number one deck in the meta currently in the last 7 days.
Yeah, post-ban, it's just like where people want to experiment. People want to play these like longer games because people feel like they've been deprived of it for a while.
Yes.
Because of sowing Mycospawn, so people just haven't sleeved that stuff up. So now that they feel like they can, that's all well and good. Like, people are like, oh, the Overton window has shifted back to where like this is a viable, reasonable thing to be doing. And it's interesting in a way where if you were to look at sowing Mycospawn as banning only the Beanstalk decks, then you're in a place where you're like, okay, that's that now the window is shifted back where Beanstalk can exist. But then it's interesting that Beanstalk, from my POV, also sort of presses out any other kind of control deck that isn't Beanstalk. Now, one deck that has been starting to pick up, though, is people playing with Quarry Steel Cutter and the Otter class that makes an
Storm Chaser's
talent. Yeah. So there's Steel Cutter, Storm Chaser's talent. This town ain't big enough sort of loop engine deck, where it will play Storm Chaser's talent and then level up to pick up This Town Ain't Big Enough out of the yard, and then use that to pick up the Storm Chaser's talent to then redeploy, get an Otter, and then you can sort of that itself is a self-recurring engine, because it's 4 mana to pick up this town. This town costs 2 mana and maybe can disrupt your opponent in some way. And so, like, that itself, those 2 cards, Insular, is at 6 mana. It means that you can always bounce one of their things and pick up and play an Otter. So for 7 mana, you have Otis, 1/1 prowess otter, and you can at least bounce one of their things. And so that's a recursive engine endgame that accrues a piece of cardboard every time off that otter, which is not, nothing. It's a legitimate threat. So like that's the only other thing that I've seen where people are really experimenting with that. And then that really goes into, okay, you're playing Corey Steel Cutter in red instead of just being in green for Beanstalk with your This Town Ain't Big Enough. And it means that they're a little bit more aggressive. They get pyroblast. So like we'll see where the world shakes out on that. My guess is that it's going to be Beanstalk is like Beanstalk with the This Town Ain't Big Enough package will just be better because that going long instead of a monk, you just overwhelm them with the card advantage, and then you can play where you don't have any cards that require other cards. But anyway, back to what you're talking about. Long-winded
Yes.
way of saying, yes, for my type of thing, I think that the Overton window has shifted on miracles as like the cards literally that have miracle on them.
Yeah.
The most
we can
playable...
look at your deck right now too. We'll pull that up just so people can see what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, it's just like, for a while I'm constantly in flux. Like, some people will ask me like, oh, do you have this other version of a thing that you like played a while ago? And unless we locked it in from a major event, I'm so constantly tinkering with my list that against a particular metagame as it's like, and I'm shifting this one more and more as the metagame right now is rapidly evolving.
Yes.
So, and there's stuff that I also want to experiment with, right? So like, I'll just throw in foros a lot of the time when I'm just thinking about it. And then like, as I either test or I realize like where my holes are, then I'll start to navigate down. So some examples for like getting a little bit creative in this list, like for sure, this is my list is still a Mystic Sanctuary list. Like Mystic Sanctuary is what I think is the new power level thing to do. And that's the one difference from like, if you look at Beanstalk control or the Otter control Just Guy lists or the Planeswalker Slam lists of old that were like playing back to basics and a bunch of the 3-drop War of the Sparkwalkers. The difference between those lists are like either they're beanstalking or they're doing that otter thing or they're doing the planeswalker thing. None of them are on 4 Mystic Sanctuary the way I am. And 4 Mystic Sanctuary is also the one area of the deck that I'm like, nothing about that is ever fluxing. Once you do that, you should be going somewhere else. Like Mystic Sanctuary.
You have to be playing at least one thwart and Mystic Sanctuary.
You have to be playing. You could play. There's probably other things that you could do in that spot. Like I think thwart is just the only one that is really reasonable. But depending on what you're building around, like there are other things that pick up lands that's totally fine if you're.
I wish we could play Gush, right?
We wish we could play Gush. There are times where I've thought about like the Tragic Lesson, which is a 2 and a blue, draw 2 cards, and then discard a card unless you pick up a land.
Yeah.
So if you have enough density, so like the thing is like unless you play a bunch of those that only pick up one land in case one Mystic Sanctuary, and I'll also caveat that I would be unwilling to play anything that is just a worse version of something else with the caveat that you get to pick up land. Like I'm not going to play Deprive when counterspell is legal.
Of course.
Because all of the times where like it would be horrendous, it would be horrendous. And of course there would be times where it'd be lights out, but like not good enough. So like I played in my previous Merchant Scroll list, I played a I played a Cryptic Command as a way to 2 to a 4 drop for counterbalance. But like that was also a way to just deal with any permanent that Prismatic Ending can't deal with. And we talked about in previous builds, or previous variations of the build where I was like, really, your blue-white X control deck is contingent on how powerful Prismatic Ending is if you're not playing Leyline Binding.
Agreed,
because anything that goes over the top of your Prismatic Ending is just going to bury you. And so having access to a Cryptic Command in my list just meant that I had somewhere in my deck, and I was playing 4 Merchant Scrolls, so I had 5 copies of a thing that theoretically could deal with anything that Prismatic Ending couldn't. And so it sort of plugged that hole. But that's like way deep in ABC. That's not the A part, right? So the A for me now, when you're looking at like, when I think of a Miracles deck list, I don't necessarily think of, oh, it has Miracle cards in it. I now think of Miracles deck list as a primarily Mystic Sanctuary deck. I think Mystic Sanctuary is essentially the Sensei's Divining Top of modern day. It's way worse, obviously, but it is powerful enough where other people in their decks might be using it as a 1 of, maybe a 2 of if they're leaning really hard, as a way, like just as a value piece.
It's basically like a hot scry for them. Yeah.
It's like a value piece in your mana base, the same way that you might play a Surveil land in your mana base, or a couple of Surveil lands, depending on like how hard of a combo deck you are. But for mine, it's like this is a Mystic Sanctuary control deck, and it just happens that because Mystic Sanctuary puts stuff on top, that it is reminiscent of how Miracles used to be built.
Finding the right high-end cards for legacy, vintage, pre-modern, or old-school Magic can be challenging. That's where friends 3-for-1 trading come in.
3-for-1 Trading is one of Europe's top Magic the Gathering retailers with an incredible selection of premium singles, sealed product, and even full sets, all available with free, fast, and secure worldwide shipping.
They add fresh inventory every Wednesday with weekly deals and discounts. So whether you're hunting for that elusive piece of power, a legacy staple, or something spicy for your collection, they've got you covered.
First high-end orders over $500 or €500, use the code EDFREE to get free worldwide shipping.
Check them out now at the number 3, the number 4, the number 1.gg/ED. That link takes you right to the shop and helps support the channel.
Huge thanks to 3-for-1 Trading for supporting the Legacy community. Now back to the show.
Where like it was, you want Terminus, therefore you want top, therefore you want counterbalance. In this world, it's like you want like insert your spell du jour, whatever that may be. So like in most cases, it would be Terminus, and then therefore you want Mystic Sanctuary, therefore you want counterbalance. So Mystic Sanctuary really tied the room in a way that no other card really could for Sensei Top. Now, if we're looking at, like right now, I'm back on playing Deduces, and I think that before the ban, where the format was a lot more compressed on the turns that you were going to get, it was more valuable to play Predict because getting both cards at a cheaper rate and being able to filter through your deck, the format was just compressed to the first two turns. If more people are going to start playing Beanstalks and stuff like that, what I have found playing against the decks that are now trying to grind with the more powerful stuff that has been out, that now sort of gets the breathing room of not having to fear the Sowing Might Go Spawn decks. Because when it comes down to taxing Troll of Khazad-dûm, those control decks, I think, would have been happy to go up against Dimir Reanimator every round of every game, every game of every round. That is a matchup where you are more or less doing pretty well. Because they have to play like the Entombs and Reanimates and stuff, they're just playing less ways to protect their stuff. So you having an over-index of ways to like run through it, there would be times where if they were on the play and they attracted you, you're buried, that game is functionally over. But there would be times where if you had set it up in a way where you just fought over the Atraxa and then they reloaded, that, okay, now that they don't have that really heavy, big way to accrue cards in a one-shot, like a huge one-shot, or a way that is a powerful engine that isn't a creature. So I never had any problem with Psychic Frog. When Psychic Frog was in the format, we talked all the time how
you had Sword Polishers.
What is everybody's problem? Yeah. Like between my Source Polishers and Prismatic Ending against Psychic Frog was actually really good because it was a 2 mana for 2 mana trade, and it was sorcery speed on them, sorcery speed on me. So we were just
felt totally fair.
It was really, really nice. It's not like they go Bowmaster, ping me, chunk me for more damage. I can't cast my spell until I Prismatic Ending at sorcery speed on the follow-up. Like that still feels bad to this day. And then Prismatic Ending against the Planeswalker still feels bad to this day. But against specifically Psychic Frog was pretty good. Now, the other side of it is like a 6/5 on turn 2, whatever, right? Troll of Khazad-dûm on turn 2, whatever. Your Source of Plowshares deck. And I was a Mystic Sanctuary recursive engine control deck, so like I always had removal spells. It was just not a problem for me if it wasn't some sort of card advantage engine. So playing against Beanstalk is a whole nother world. It's so much more difficult because when Beanstalk is on the table, nothing else matters. Like we've had this episode before. Like go back to like 2 bans ago, back when Bowmaster was pinching on 50% of the metagame. When we talked about Beanstalk then, and I played Beanstalk, I was just like, oh yeah, the only thing that matters is Beanstalk. And then it's just going to be an arms race of Beanstalking. And so, like, I have a couple games on 90s MTG where it's like I'm playing 4 Force of Will, 4 Force of Negation, and I brought in my my Mind Break trap post board against like mirrors, and that like surprised people. And I'm like, no, because it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is if you have Beanstalk parity, and if you have more Beanstalks than they have Beanstalks, you win. That's it. Nothing else matters. There's going to be a ton of fireworks, and there's going to be a bunch of other interactions. You're going to be, things will happen throughout the game, and none of it is relevant. The only thing that is relevant is if you have Beanstalk on the table, and if you have more Beanstalks than your opponent. That's it. Everything else is nonsense, including if they have a card advantage on you. If they have an Uro, and you have a Beanstalk, you're way ahead. It's not close. You are leagues and bounds. The only thing that matters is Beanstalk. So looking at the way that the game would functionally end in the pre-ban format to where it is now with Beanstalk being relevant, the game is functionally over if a Beanstalk is on the table. There's just more turns where nothing that matters will happen. So more nothing will happen over time just because the game doesn't actually end on the spot. But the game is over if the Beanstalk is there, you are not winning that game unless you're comboing them out by going under, right? So what that means is like the Overton window that like when you were like, hey, let's do the Overton window episode of Theory is like now the control deck, like before you could like remove their engine and then just go through the one shot of thing that they did. But now every single card in their card is going to get a card. And so the game will always be high resource. And so you have to cut off that engine in a way where it's like against Dimir Reanimator, you could let Atraxa in some positions resolve and then remove the Atraxa and then just fight through that one burst of card advantage that they got of 4 or 5 cards, right? Against Beanstalk, you can't fight through those cards because every single card that you fight through has already replaced itself.
Exactly. Yeah. And,
so I want to, like,
you know, and that's I guess a nod as well.
The reason that Terminus is no longer a viable like build around is because if you play Terminus and remove all of their creatures, hold on, sorry, you stalled for a second. You want me to keep going?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So the reason before when you were like, oh yeah, Terminus, when we were talking about Terminus not being viable as a build around anymore, it's because when you play Terminus, it requires some amount of infrastructure in your deck in order to convert it as a miracle. Like, yes, sometimes you'll get natural miracles and it'll be in ripe situations, and that's great, but that's not the consistent floor. You need some amount of infrastructure in your deck to support it, whether that's like knowing how your brainstorms are going to operate, or knowing that you have to play some sort of additional instant speed cantrips, or you have to be able to play some sort of additional catch-up mechanic if you want the board to expand, in which case you're going to have to tax your life total. So when you would convert a Terminus, you're converting it for both time and value, assuming that then you can recoup that over time because the game will go long enough. The issue is that now, because every threat that you would otherwise sweep up, has already replaced itself in some fashion, or is an individually powerful enough threat that you have to convert that Terminus against that singular threat, that your opponent still controls the narrative in that position because they could just choose not to overextend into that Terminus. And they know that you still are or will be compelled to respect the creature that's on the table to then have to act. So Terminus's value in that sense has gone way, way, way down because you can't actually convert it for value. Even if you 3-for-1 them, you sweep up 3 of their creatures, those creatures have accrued replacement value for themselves already. So even though you may have gone up on mana, you have spent time and infrastructure in your play pattern and build to convert that Terminus and then still end up down cards. And that's where it's no longer good. In the world where, like, when people were teasing if Deathrite Shaman was going to get unbanned, I was like, oh man, if Deathrite gets unbanned, we're immediately going back to 4 Terminus. Yeah. Because that is the kind of world where because they have to commit, like Deathrite Shaman has to commit to the board, and then if they want to commit any other creature to the board, then that Terminus is going to 2-for-1 because it will catch whatever it is, even if that second creature replaces itself, but then it will trade up on that Deathrite Shaman.
Yeah, so we're basically back to a world where you're playing TNN off of a Deathrite Shaman, right? Like you have to play the Terminuses.
Yeah. In the world of like, you know, Deathrite into TNN or Deathrite into Leovold, like, yes, you want to be on Terminus because, man, is that a great exchange for you, right? In this world, it is just not. So, and since the Deathrite is still on the ban list, all of that stuff, and now we're still in the world of like the worst thing that you're going to put on the table that isn't directly replacing itself with a card is a Dragon Rage Channeler. And you can't let that Dragon Rage Channeler sit on the table for that long. Like you aren't in that space in this world. Like that's not, you would have to trade immediately. So Terminus is no longer that build around. That's an example of the Overton window shifting. Now if we were to zoom out on that, when we look at like, okay, Terminus wasn't good enough against the compressed format decks because, you know, if it's playing against a troll, they just don't have to extend past that troll. If they put an Atraxa or an Archon into play, those things have already replaced themselves. There was a brief moment in time when people were playing around with Metamorphosis Fanatic.
Yes.
When Metamorphosis Fanatic was around, boy, was it great to be a little Terminus gamer for that short, like, week and a half, 2-week window.
Yeah.
Because you just, like, fight over their thing. They Metamorphosis Fanatic to, like, you know, rebuy their troll or whatever, and they just put 10 power of lifelink on the table, and you're like, whatever, Terminus your shit. Those cards are just power and toughness on the table. That's exactly where Terminus wants to be. Good luck. Like, if you're not replacing yourself, then Terminus is going to be delightful. But because now every creature replaces itself, like including like you cast Murktide and Beanstalks on the table, it's like even if you trade your Terminus for that Murktide, it's already replaced itself. You're down. You're still way worse. So I think that for this version of control, we have to shift. We have to fight on the axis that matters, and that axis, the thing moving the Overton window, is the game is over if Beanstalk is on the table. You are playing a game, but it's just a game that is irrelevant as long as that Beanstalk is the thing that's there. Beanstalk itself is a power outlier. And that's going to be the thing that the battle is always going to be about no matter what. And if you are in a Beanstalk mirror and somebody casts a card advantage spell against you that isn't Beanstalk, you probably don't need to fight over it. If you have a Beanstalk, you're just way ahead. You're ahead by a mile. One of the things that I'm sampling with now to see how much of that, like, there's no doubt in my mind that is the case. That, like, if you have a beanstalk, you are incredibly far ahead by leagues and bounds. Nothing else matters until the fight over that beanstalk is won. I want to test that now without having to go into my own beanstalk of what is the world where if they go cast beanstalk, of course you play force of will fighting their beanstalk. They always have the way to the thing to protect it. So it goes, they cast beanstalk, you force it, they force back, they draw a card. You untap, and then the thing that I want to experiment right now, and this is where, like,
well, they're not going to draw a card for that force.
No, but they do draw a card off the beanstalk, and now they have replaced itself, and then that's what makes that force of will exchange still good, because they have the engine on the table that has recouped that force of will, and now you're way behind.
Yes.
Right? In a way that is insurmountable. And so I'm thinking that to see how valuable that actually is in a way without having to play beanstalk yourself, in which case you, like, once you play beanstalk, you're sort of priced into playing a certain number of cards that just naturally work with it beyond force of will.
Of course.
And I don't like that because I feel like that feels inflexible to me. And I've never liked that a part of playing with beanstalk when I do play it.
Yeah, this is where we came to the conclusion that you wanted to have a, like, 2 mana cap to your deck at one point. Hey, Legacy fans, since you're enjoying the show, please like and subscribe the video. It helps the channel grow.
Support Eternal Turtles on Patreon so we can create even more content and cover events.
Patreons get an ad-free RSS feed, 4 bonus episodes a month, and Discord recognition. Join the Dirtle Maniacs at patreon.com/eternaldurtles.
Now back to the show. Yeah, and that will alleviate a little bit now that, like, because Beanstalk is the biggest percentage of meta, the turn cycle of games is not compressed in the same way that it was with Reanimator. And
maybe 1 to 2 turns fully, I think.
Now, I think that, like, if, like, Beanstalk being in play changes the rules of engagement, but the compression of the format to the first 2 turns in the way that we had talked about before, where it's like every time the game, like, when the game is effectively over, that soon that you never got to deploy your land, those were functional mulligans.
Yes.
The thing with Beanstalk is Beanstalk's not killing you fast. They're just effectively making everything you do irrelevant. But that's different from when you wouldn't be able to deploy your lands, which, in case we're effective mulligans, you will be able to deploy those lands. Like, the games will likely go long enough.
You do feel like you're still playing Magic.
You will at least get to develop past the point where it would otherwise not matter. But, like, as long, like, your development against the Beanstalk won't matter because the development will just be irrelevant. But you will get to do it. That's different than what you were before, where you didn't get to do it because the game was actually over. You see what I'm saying?
I do.
So, like, the compression of I don't want to play anything less than 2 is different in a world of Beanstalk. If anything, you do need some amount of stuff that's going to go over 2 because you have to be able to either play your own Beanstalks or you have to do something that's so overwhelming, like, in comparison, that, like, when the dust settles, that you have somehow made it. The thing is I don't think there is anything like that against Beanstalk. That's
the point I wanted to sort of come to is we were talking about the Overton window. We spoke about Beanstalk, but then one of the things I've kind of figured out in my dotage in this format is that I like a deck that has 2 legacy power level things to do. So when you're playing against these decks that are like the hallmark, like, this is the best deck in the format, which I'm not generally the person who plays, like, the best deck in the format, unless the deck that I'm playing becomes the best deck in the format, that happened with Rug Delver for a while and stuff like that. I like to play a deck that has, like, 2 legacy power level things to do, so that when I'm fighting against a Beanstalk deck or I'm fighting against a Reanimator deck or something like that, I have 2 fronts, the 2 front plan. They have to fight me on 2 axes, right? And so what I've learned over, like, the last week is I finally found a second deck that does that. That's not, Cephalid Breakfast. And that's where I came to the conclusion of, like, the thing I really like to do in Legacy, the power level thing to do for me in Legacy, and this has been the case, I want to say, since just after the pandemic, is Ancient Tomb Urza Saga or Urza Saga value in some way, right? And so now, last week I got a chance to play Stifle Knot, and I was like, wow, this has it. This has Ancient Tomb Urza Saga as, like, 1 level of power level thing to do, and then you get to do your Stifle Knot stuff too. And those plans don't compete with each other in any way. In fact, they serve each other quite well, because then you can play Toper Orb on the first turn, and then the second turn you can drop another land or play Urza Saga. Urza Saga gets the what's called Dreadnought. So I think in this Overton window shift, of course, the right thing to do is, sure, go ahead and play Up the Beanstalk. I played it and it was very. It felt powerful when it happened when I got it out. I also had some games where it just didn't make the grade. There was one game I played against Oops All Spells that was like, I'm not even playing Magic. There was a game with Bosch and Roll where he got me to 0 permanents on the board, and his quote in his Discord was, I was like, you didn't get all. He's like, perfect victory, and I was like, I have cards in my hand. You didn't get me for everything. He's like, yeah, well, when you don't have any lands, you're gonna have cards in your hand. I was like, but to that end, looking at these decks that have two legacy power level things to do that your opponent has to respect in some form or another, especially against an Up the Beanstalk deck where you are okay. I'm going to be the 12-12 deck, right? Can you beat my 12-12? Yeah, they probably can. They have a lot of removal. Can they beat a bunch of constructs on top of that? That's where things start to get interesting, because sure, they can have a lot of cards, but if they're not able to keep up with your uncounterable beaters, so they can't force of will into your 4/4s that have whatever Swiftfoot boots or whatever on them that you put into your deck, and you have this package of your saga package, whatever that might be. I think there is a window of opportunity there for decks like that to thrive. Now we haven't necessarily seen it yet, but good pilots can make those decks take down the field. When everyone is hopping onto the Beanstalk bandwagon, that means that the delta of the great player versus the player who just picked this up is pretty high, right? Like, you're going to get people who just pick up whatever deck is good because they want to win at Legacy, but don't necessarily have the reps in to beat a true pilot of another deck. That's what, where we see some of the stuff when I'm playing Cephalid Breakfast, where someone's like, oh, I'm going to Orcish Bowmaster your guy. And I'm like, well, I will shift the damage from the core Nomad over to this Narcomoeba that I cast that seemed like a bad idea at the time. And then next turn I just play a Cephalid Illusionist and win the game. Being a more nuanced pilot of a deck is going to get you a lot further than, like, say, playing the best deck a lot of times. Not all the time. Obviously, Up the Beanstalk is very good, but it's not as brainless as, say, Reanimate Troll, Reanimate Atraxa, right? You do have to do some work for it. If the meta is correct right now, if this is what the meta looks like, where it's like Beanstalk, Stompy, Dimir Tempo, Oops All Spells, all at like 10 to 9%, and then what? Painter is at 7, Teamer Delver, Grixis Tempo, Mystic Forge, Omnitel, and Ocelot Pride midrange. Well, that's the last 7 days where the decks are all in that like 5 to 3% place. You're going to get a lot of people, if you've been a true pilot of your deck, you're going to get a lot of people who just are picking up decks on the willy-nilly, that they know how to attack one part of your deck because they read a sideboard guide, but they don't know how to attack the other part of your deck. So I think the Overton window shifts here a little bit, but you do have the ability to beat people just on the margins of being like, I'm good at this deck.
Yeah, I want to clarify on when we say that there are 2 legacy power level things to do in a deck. I imagine that can be pretty confusing because, if you hear 2 legacy power level things to do, you go, how do you balance that? And then you're thinking, okay, maybe that's putting a lot of load onto my cantrips to like find the route for that. But I think tell me if I'm wrong here, but what I'm hearing you say between 2 legacy power level things to do is really you're talking about what is your A and what is your C in your ABC.
Yes, yeah.
Build.
So perfect example is like Cephalid Breakfast, core Cephalid legacy power level thing to do, right? The breakfast part of Cephalid Breakfast is a legacy power level thing to do. Nadu and core, any way to target Nadu is the other legacy power level thing to do there. Now you also have access to Urza Saga, but it's not as big a part of the plan.
If you think about it, if you were to just use like the really clean template of Terminus, therefore top, therefore counterbalance, what I think like you're looking at really for something like Breakfast is it's really Nadu / Cephalid Illusionist, therefore Nomads / Shuko, and
Correct.
then it's figuring out what that third part is.
Which is Saga, right?
Well, some people, typically people go to Saga, but not every version of Bant Nadu is a Saga deck.
Well, not every version of Nadu is Saga, but every version of Cephalid Breakfast is.
Yeah. And so but if you're looking at it through those, of course, like one is going to accrue a bunch of cards, one is a combo kill. And like, yes, you need to be a person that is actually conscious at the table and understand which one of these things is going to be better against the opponent you're sitting across from. But for the example that when it comes down to how you have constructed that deck with that infrastructure in place, in your design and your card choices, that is going to inform how you are supposed to use those tools in a matchup. Now, I'm bringing this up because when you were talking about that league that you did with Beanstalk, I watch all of your content. Everybody should watch your content. Everybody watch Zach's content when he's making gameplay action.
Mistakes.
Now, well, the thing is like there's a difference between mistakes and whether or not you recognize that that is a mistake of gameplay or if that's a mistake in how you're actually using the tools that you put into your deck in the first place. Now, there was one game where you were playing the Beanstalk deck and you had the one of Stifle that's been sort of carried over from previous times. Now, whether or not that Stifle should be,
two of Stifle, actually.
Two of Stifle. Whether or not Stifles are the things that you should use in your flex spot, up for debate in this new world where people are trying different things. But you had the two Stifle in your deck. And there was one game where you went land go and your opponent cracked a fetch and you were like, oh, we're doing it. And you stifled them. You stifled their fetch. And then they went force of will on your Stifle. Now, that is such an overwhelmingly good thing to happen against your Stifle. But then you got caught up in it, Zach.
I'm sorry. I'm a Rug Delver player at heart.
You went, oh, we're doing it. And you forced back your force. And the second I watched that video where you forced back your force, I was like, oh, Zach's losing this game.
I live in this world, Phil, where I won so many games with Rug Delver on the Stifle Wasteland plan that it's very hard for me to realize that like people are probably playing a couple more lands in their control decks nowadays, and that generally doesn't end the game for a lot of people.
Zach, I think that like all of the stuff that we talk about, being able, like, if anything, you deserve all the credit in the world for putting that on display in a way that was like very earnest and then like talking about it here. I think like we should link to that in the description. That game where you make that play.
It's over here somewhere.
Like that is such an educational moment because you were playing the deck going, we're gonna figure out, we're gonna learn how to play beans, we're gonna do the thing, and in that position, whatever it is that you as the Beanstalk player or like the pilot building that in constructing that deck, putting the Stifle in your list for, you're a 2 of Stifle. And you're not a Wasteland deck. You're not trying to mana deny. That's not what your game plan is. Like, yes, there's going to be some moments where you incidentally get to fire off the Stifle on their fetch and catch them. And that's, in a position where you're like, I already have the play. I'm already advantaged in this game. I want to extend that advantage because if I can get 2 land drops to their one and just be ahead by a turn cycle, I'm okay going down the card on that. Or playing the Stifle here as opposed to anything else because I don't think that this matchup, if you knew what the matchup was, is going to be anything else. But when you fought over that Stifle, you abandoned what your game is actually going to be about because you were like, I am trying to manage. Now, that's not bad. That's the quintessential learning experience. Like, you have that game. You can look back at that game, and then never again will you make that mistake in a way where you were like, we're going to cheese them.
Yeah, no,
you were like so excited for the cheese. But like your deck is not about cheesing, right?
Eternal Dirtles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned.
Well, I think that's one of the important things about that content is like a lot of times, like now that I have this access to a large swath of the card pool, if not all of the card pool, right, is I like to try and look and play these decks that I would not normally play an Up the Beanstalk Sultai deck in a tournament, but it gives me a chance to get in the driver's seat of that deck and see what the weaknesses are, see what a player on that that level that we were talking about that like just picks up the deck to play it, see what they're thinking in their head and see if I can get those players in the early rounds. In the top 8, you're not going to hit a guy like me, right? Like a guy with that mindset for that deck is gonna be chaff for the people that end up making the top 8. But it allows me and the person watching to get in the driver's seat of that deck and say, here are the mistakes that a person can make with this deck, and then be like, okay, well, even a person who has like a lot of Legacy experience can look at any of these decks, make 1 or 2 mistakes, and get crushed. And then it also allows me to learn just how that deck is played. So like we walk into the deck knowing almost nothing aside from like here's a bunch of cards. We know how this works, right? And at the end, what I'm hoping people get out of this is not like, oh, I played a league perfectly. I'm not that guy. Like I've never have been. The perfect league guy that like never makes a mistake or whatever. These are it's the classic Zen Buddhist, when you lose, don't lose the lesson, right? Like, you just want to be able to look at that and be like, okay, here are the common mistakes that you can make with this deck. Let's not make them in the future, or watch out for your opponent to make them, because then you have an advantage.
Yeah,
And I'm not doing it on purpose, for sure. Like, I'm not saying like, so I'm the big braining this. I'm just saying, it gives us that chance.
Yeah, I want to circle it back to the idea that you were talking about of where the Overton window is on like what cards are playable or what cards are better suited for, where the current metagame is. That idea for like the ABC style deck building and like the card choices that you make and understanding that infrastructure of your build and your card choices, that is what will inform you about whether or not your accuracy on whether or not you're thinking the Overton window has shifted on the power level of your card is actually correct. If you aren't applying your cards in the maximal fashion of like why they're in your deck in the first place, like if you're just playing your cards and like hopefully it lines up, you're not going to have anything to actually base it against, right? If you're like, I'm putting this card in my deck to do this thing, and then you are setting yourself in positions for it to do that thing, and then it's still not effective against that thing, you go, okay, maybe the Overton window is shifted on that card.
Yeah, now, well, that was my exact thought, was like, after losing a couple games with Stifle in the deck, I thought to myself, why is Stifle in this deck?
But that also could be that like figuring out what Stifle is in the deck for in the first place. But like you also have to, I think, determine what that is before you even sit down against the metagame that you anticipate playing against, and then actually leveraging that card in those positions as best you possibly can. Because if we go back to that example where you fired it off on that fetch on turn one, it's like you firing it off on that fetch turn one and then them forcing it, that's the advantage bar way over in your favor. The second you force back, the advantage bar way back in their favor. And it happened that fast. Now, that is just because whatever the Stifle is not part of your infrastructure for like Beanstalk. It was a
correct.
Flex.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be in the deck to make Beanstalk happen.
Right. Now that's different if you're playing the Stifle Knot deck, in which case you have to think like the Stifles are here to stifle Dreadnoughts. Now, every time I use the Stifle to not stifle the Dreadnought, that means that I'm using it against something else that is valuable enough for me to not have it for what my deck is trying to do. And if that's the case, then that means that there's going to be more load placed on Stifle in the metagame that I'm going into. If I'm trying to use Stifle for the purposes of whatever I used it for that wasn't stifling the Dreadnought, then I'm inherently applying more load to that Stifle. Now, that's reasonable if you're like, this is how I want games to play out. And I also don't think that I need the Stifle as heavily because I'm playing so many dress downs or I'm playing a bunch of Torpor Orbs to try and alleviate the load that's on the Stifle for Dreadnought purposes. But if you're not thinking like, I can fire off Stifle against X, Y, and Z that I anticipate facing when I'm presented with those positions, because there was enough load spread across the other cards that Stifle is a part of to engage in what my legacy power level thing to do is in the first place, then you go, oh, actually, I don't even need Stifles anymore. Like maybe Torpor Orbs
and that's where we are now in this deck. We're on the 4 Torpor Orb for what's called Dress Down plan. You're not even playing Stifle.
Yeah, and that's what I mean as an example of like, oh, okay, so the Overton window that we're talking about, like suggested here, is like, yeah, the Overton window is just shifted on Stifle as part of that package. You just don't need it anymore. It's not powerful enough in the non-positions that are Stifle Dreadnought, and there are enough things that are better at stifling the Dreadnought than Stifle now, and Stifle is not offsetting any load or solving any other problem that the shell otherwise has against any of the other metagames, so I don't need Stifle anymore. Like in that case, that's an example of like Stifle and where I'm at with like a lot of my Termini at this point, right? Like Termini is not solving the same problems that it once was. And there may be better things to solve it than what Terminus was doing. And so I don't need to play all of the Terminus anymore because it just doesn't line up in the way that I need it to be the legacy power level thing that I'm trying to do. Right? That is an example. But you only get there if you know why the cards are even in your deck in the first place, and then actually trying to test them in that fashion.
And that is literally the thesis of the episode.
That's the thesis of the episode, but I want to clarify that because if anybody else is thinking in this new world of like, Beanstalk being the 10% deck and like people are trying new things with the new set that just came out, which has a bunch of bangers in it, and we're going through and when you're just trying it out, like I've been playing Rally the Monastery the last couple of weeks, and it has been extremely underwhelming to me. Now, it was compared to what I was expecting it to do. Now, do I think that's because the card is bad? No, it's because I'm realizing as I play with it that the card requires a whole lot more infrastructure than I thought it did. And that goes back to our ABC infrastructure of, if rally is the legacy power level thing to do, then what am I using to support it? You see what I'm saying? Like, we're getting there. The thing is, like, I'm realizing Rally the Monastery does not slot into the infrastructure that I had before the ban, which was a merchant scroll list, right? The infrastructure was there to support merchant scroll, not to support Rally the Monastery. And so trying to put them together, I ran into a bunch of clunky, awkward draws that like were not conducive to what my plan was. But then as I sharpen that more, I expect Rally the Monastery's power level to increase in the shell that I'm putting it in, because it's actually falling more in alignment with the ABC, because then I can sit down, open my hand, and go, okay, what am I trying to do in the dark? I'm trying to do this. These are the tools that support that. These are the roles that they're supposed to function within. And therefore, I can actually employ that when I'm at the table, without trying to just hope that things line up properly, and then also know where I need to fight over different things. And we've talked about that in the load bearing episode, like where are my cards supposed to line up that I've intended for them before I even sat down at the table. So like, all that is to say, the Overton window on deck theory is sort of an all-encompassing idea for card choices within this structure. And if you can look at the cards that you're thinking about playing, a lot of that right now for Beanstalk players is Rakshas's Bargain, right? People are going like, how good is this? Where do I need it? And if it goes like, is this just another one of like the generic things that Beanstalk makes good? Or is this thing good enough on its own? And that is people like sort of feeling it out right now. And there's a world where like when you're playing a Beanstalk deck where you're like, okay, when I have Beanstalk, I'm unbeatable. When I don't have Beanstalk, my deck sucks. And it's like, okay, is there a way to sort of bridge that gap a little bit? Is Rakshas's Bargain essentially like worse Beanstalks, but functioning as the Beanstalks 5 through 8 or 5 through whatever in order to bridge that gap to get us there? Now, when I was playing Beanstalk, I was just playing the full boat of Portent, or like, I bounced between like Portent and Preordain, because I was like, I just need more cantrips to find the Beanstalk. Like the games where Beanstalk is so much better than the games without it, I need it. And so like I just devoted a bunch of my flex slots to ensuring that I found the Beanstalk in the first place, because that was the legacy power level thing to do. And I was like, if I don't have that, then my deck doesn't function in the way that I'm intending it to. So like in ways where other people might have had the stifles, I had more cantrips because I'm trying to find the Beanstalk. Like that is a choice that I'm making, understanding like I'm only making that choice because of the structure that I know is in place, where it's like, I know that like I'm trying to solve whatever problems I'm trying to solve, but that starts with me getting the power level thing to do online.
Yeah. Well, okay. With that said, I want to ask a question to the audience. A comment below on this. Has the Overton window shifted on any deck that you've played over the years? And are there 2 legacy power level things to do in the deck you're playing right now? Have a good one, everybody.
Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.